Good morning and welcome to this Wednesday morning webinar for people around the country of India, and some of you might have joined us from outside. Capacity Building Commission and the Karmayogi Bharat have been having these weekly webinars on different subjects that helps us understand and continue a journey of lifelong learning. Today, it's an extraordinary privilege and a great opportunity for all of us that Professor Francis Fukuyama has been joining us live and virtually from the United States, from California. For most of us in the space of human development, those of us who work in democracy, international politics, is a very familiar name, and his seminal work is a great guidance that many of us draw inspiration from. And I'm sure his 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, which has been published in more than 20 foreign editions, is something extraordinary. For me, it's a special privilege because a lot of his writings and readings and research material has part of my recommended readings for my students in the development course that I used to teach. And we have had also his team recently, which came down to India to help train our bureaucrats from different our training academies to start becoming case writers and then become case teachers. Now, it's also a double treat for me that the university where I used to teach at Cornell, Professor Fukuyama did his undergrad from there and then went on to do his PhD from Harvard, which I'm also an alumni. So there's a lot more ways I'm trying to seek connections with Professor Fukuyama. And he was earlier with the RAND Corporation. Then he was also had a stint with the US Department of State. And now he's at Stanford University. And his work, it goes on, and he's got honorary doctorates from across the world. But more importantly, his thinking and his books are something which is phenomenal. And for most of us in the space of capacity building and looking at the state, it's important for us to understand some of what he has written. And today he'll be sharing with us his thoughts, his ideas, and a lot of his what I would call as views on how state capacity can be built. And so it's a great opportunity to have you here, Professor Fukuyama. And I know it's a late evening for you, but it shows your commitment to building state capacity around the world, that you could join us today despite your very hectic schedule. So welcome again, and I welcome all the viewers and people who have joined. As all of you understand that this will also be recorded, and it will be on our Karmayogi Bharat portal for all of you to watch, and it will be part of a repository of information, and material from this will also be available in different formats so that people can continue to benefit from his wisdom and learning. So I now request Professor Fukuyama to deliver his this Wednesday morning webinar for us. Thank you again for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Dr. Balu. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to this audience. This is one of my favorite topics, is how to build state capacity. And I understand that we had a successful online program with my Leadership Academy to teach case writing and case teaching for use in the training of public servants in India. So I'm very happy to follow that on with this lecture. I'm going to show a number of slides and talk through them. This is a lecture that we typically give with our Leadership Academy program. So if you'll permit me, I will try to get this up on the screen. Okay, can people see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, very good. So this is a general lecture on approaches to improving state capacity. So we just begin with some basic definitions. What is a modern state? Max Weber gave the most famous definition of the state, the German sociologist, 19th century sociologist. He said that the state is a legitimate monopoly of force over a defined territory. There are four terms: monopoly, force, territory, and legitimacy. And if any one of those is missing, you don't really have a state. So states are basically about power. There's another distinction that Weber made between modern states and patrimonial states. Most states in human history have been what he called patrimonial states. The word patrimonial comes from pater, the Latin word pater, or father. So the state is seen as an outgrowth of the ruler's household. and the ruler rules that state the way that he would rule his own household, family, children, and so forth. And so it's run really for the benefit of the ruler's friends, the ruler's family. And that's really the way many states were organized traditionally. You called the ruler a king or a monarch, sometimes an emperor, but it was basically done on a personal basis with his friends and family. A modern state, by contrast, is impersonal, meaning that people are treated equally as citizens, not as friends or relatives of the ruler, but as citizens. Uh, States have existed for thousands of years, but modern states are much more recent. Uh, in one of my books, I argued that China was the first world civilization that created a modern state in the sense of being centralized, bureaucratic, based on meritocracy. And this kind of state has been very successful and has spread, but is still not the majority of states in the world. I would say that the majority of states today in the 21st century are still patrimonial states. But what we want to aspire to is to create a modern state. And one of the problems is that you have political decay. It's a long word, repatrimonialization, meaning that there's constant uh, temptations for rulers to turn their states back over to their friends and family and not have them run uh, impersonally. And we see, unfortunately, examples of this happening all over the world. The most recent one, I think, with the election of Donald Trump. He doesn't understand the concept of a modern impersonal state. He wants his friends and family in positions of power. And unfortunately, in the US, I think we're going to see a lot of this in the coming weeks and months. I had this phrase, getting to Denmark, as a um, symbol of what we aspire to, because Denmark is a small country that has a modern state with very low levels of corruption, very high state capacity, and an ability to deliver basic services to citizens that is really admired by many people around the world. Now, we also want to connect a modern state to democracy. And depending on whether you have a authoritarian or a tyrannical state or a liberal democracy, state capacity and your attitude towards the state is different. I think that if you are living in a dictatorship, of which there are unfortunately a growing number in the world, you want to resist and limit state power. And over the years, we've developed constitutional systems that create institutional checks and balances to prevent the executive from doing whatever the executive wants. And that's really a liberal state. That's the essence of being a liberal state. On the other hand, if you are a reformer and you live in a democratic state, a state that already has some degree of rule of law and democratic accountability, you really want to increase the legitimate power of the state. And that's what we're really going to talk about today. And that's the Indian context that you are operating in. Unfortunately, many new democracies have failed to create modern states. We have several examples of this where you have very incompetent or highly corrupt states or states that are abusive, and they don't find the right balance between legitimate state power and the checks and balances that are necessary in a liberal democracy. Now, if you think about the problem of development, there are actually several components to it. When people talk about development, they usually talk about economic growth. But when an economy grows and you industrialize and you increase the complexity of your economy, you create a division of labor. This was an insight of the great political economist Adam Smith. Economic growth produces social mobilization, meaning that the society creates new organizations. It creates firms in the private sector, nonprofit organizations, associations of various sorts. But in addition to society, you also have the development of political institutions. And in my view, there are three critical ones. So the first is the state itself, which I just defined as a monopoly of legitimate force over territory. And then you have a rule of law. I think that law really needs to be thought of as a constraint on the state. Law defines the limits of state action, and it protects the rights of individuals from the power of the state. The state is a very powerful and at times deadly institution, and law is what limits that power. And then if you live in a liberal democracy, in addition, you have mechanisms of accountability. You just had a long election period in India in which citizens have the power to hold their rulers accountable and change them if they don't like their performance. And in that respect, both rule of law and accountability are both limitations on the power of the state. Now, in what was called modernization theory, there was an idea that all good things went together, that if you had economic growth, you had social mobilization, and you would have a modern state and decreasing levels of corruption, and everybody would be happy in these modern institutions. Unfortunately, that is not the case, and each of these dimensions of development, economic growth, social mobilization, the state, rule of law, democracy, all of these can be independent of one another, and it's possible to find instances of countries with different balances of these different components. China is an authoritarian country. It has a very good, high quality modern state, but it has no rule of law in the sense that I defined it, and certainly no democratic accountability. On the other hand, many developing countries have some degree of democracy, some degree of law, but very, very weak states. And that is a problem that really is hindering their development. I think all of you listening today should agree that if you don't have a competent, high capacity modern state, you're simply not going to develop. You have many examples of countries with lots of natural resources that are corrupt and basically fail to give their citizens any kind of satisfactory performance. Nigeria might be an example of that. So it's not resources that create development. It's really the presence of a high capacity modern state. So in a sense, what you need is a kind of balance. You have the state on the one hand, which is the power institution, and then you have rule of law and you have democracy that are constraints on that power. And you don't want a state that is too powerful and unconstrained, but you also don't want, just rule of law and democracy without having a competent state. And getting that balance right is really the difficult task that modern liberal democracies have to aim for. Now, it might be a little difficult to define what good governance is, but we can certainly define what bad governance is. So bad governance is corruption in many different forms. This is an appropriation of public resources for private benefit, for the benefit of those people that run the state. There's a related phenomenon that is actually just as prevalent, if not more so, which is called clientelism by political scientists, or patronage, where a politician delivers resources to individuals in return for political support. This is an almost universal practice in the United States. We had a deeply rooted patronage system in the 19th century that was very difficult to get past. This is really one of the great challenges, to move from a patrimonial, patronage-based state to a modern state that is high capacity and impersonal. But the other component of bad governance is simply lack of state capacity. State capacity is just people. States are built around the people that run the state, and if they don't have adequate skills, education, the kinds of qualifications to manage a money supply, to deliver public health, to build infrastructure, then you're not going to have successful governance. And so you do need technocrats that have these specific sectoral skills in order to be able to provide the kinds of services that your citizens demand. Now, we should just go over this briefly because uh, the public sector is obviously very different from the private sector. And I would say that there are four main differences. So the first is that public agencies can't go bankrupt like a private company can. And that's an important discipline that the private sector has that the public sector does not. If you are running a school system and it's not doing a good job in educating students, you don't go out of business. You keep working and you're paid whether you're doing a good job or not. And so you don't have that kind of discipline that the prospect of bankruptcy uh, poses in the private sector. Oftentimes, states have mandates that are not under, or agencies have mandates that are not under their control. The political principles in a political system often tell their subordinate bureaucracies to do things, sometimes things that are contradictory. You want to increase economic growth, but you also want to control environmental pollution, and you want to distribute resources in a way that serves the poor, but you also want to make sure that the wealthy are able to invest and grow their businesses. And sometimes you cannot do all of those things simultaneously, but that's what your political masters tell you to do. This is an important issue that you cannot retain earnings, and therefore it's very hard to motivate public servants to be efficient. In a private company, if you do very well and you have a big surplus at the end of the fiscal year, you can pay yourself a bonus or your shareholders a bonus. In a public agency, if you have a surplus in your agency by the end of the fiscal year, what do? You spend the money because you can't keep it. You can't keep it into the next year. You can't pay yourself bonuses. And so there's really no incentive to be efficient and to maximize your earnings as in a private company. And finally, you oftentimes do not control your own factors of production. The most important is labor, really, because many public agencies have to work with labor unions that have work rules and other kinds of regulations that they have imposed because of their political clout. And therefore, you can't simply fire people, you can't move them around, you can't do mergers and acquisitions, the sorts of things that a private company would be able to do. And that limits the way that you can reform a public sector. And this is one of the reasons why you can't ever make it as efficient as the private sector. Now, there's two broad approaches to government reform, and I think that they are these views are held by different approaches within the social sciences. To improve the government, you have to change their motivation. You have to change the motivation of officials, and there are two separate theories about how you do this. The one is the one that economists hold. They think about human motivation in a particular way, that human beings are so-called rational utility maximizers. In plain language, it means that they're selfish and they want to use their rationality to maximize their incomes. And this leads to something that economists call principal agent theory. What that theory says is there's a principal who's the boss. The boss hires agents to carry out his or her will. And the problem occurs when the agents don't have the incentives, the proper incentives to do what the principal wants them to do. And that's the problem with corruption, for example, that with corruption, the agent wants to steal money from the treasury rather than using the money for the public purposes that are designated. And so that's the general framework under which economists have thought about dealing with issues like corruption and improving public service delivery. On the other hand, I think that sociologists or social psychologists have a very different attitude towards the way human beings are motivated. They believe that they are inherently social creatures. They're not these selfish individuals that are created in economic theory, but rather they are regulated by norms. They have a strong desire to conform to social norms. And if you want to motivate people to work better in a government, you have to change the normative framework. You have to change the culture of the organization rather than changing incentives. And so you think about this in terms of improving school performance. You can either uh, incentivize people to teach better by giving them bonuses if they do well, or punishing them, taking away their salaries, firing them if they do poorly. On the other hand, many of the best school systems, like the ones in Scandinavia, use norms rather than incentives. They create a class of public servants that are dedicated to public interest, and therefore the protection against corruption is an internal one and not as a result of external monitoring. Now, the dominant approach to improving public sector performance has really been put forward in recent decades by economists. They want to try to make the public sector more like the private sector, and there are a number of ways of doing this. One is performance management. Another is by privatizing and outsourcing certain public functions. New public management was a trend, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, that applied business principles to public management. Another is offering an exit option out of the public sector and trying to create some degree of competition among public agencies. And then finally, shortening the route of accountability. That is to say, moving services closer to the people who are served and giving them a way of holding public servants accountable through elections, through school boards, through other kinds of public participation mechanisms. So I'm going to go over each of these in turn. Each of them has some merit, but in the end, they've also got limitations. Now, this is the principal agent theory that I just described. So you have a principal who are the people in a democracy, right? The people vote. They vote for their delegates in the legislature, in the Congress. In a rule of law system with an independent judiciary, there's a separate and parallel judicial structure that operates in parallel to the legislature. And both of them give directions to the prime minister, the cabinet. The prime minister and the cabinet establish a bureaucracy, and then the bureaucracy may empower implementing organizations. And again, there's a clear hierarchy where the agents and the sub-agents have to do the bidding of the principal. And as I said, for the economists, the problem comes when somebody, let's say in the bureaucracy, wants to pay money into his own bank account rather than into the public treasury. And so the question is, how do you align incentives? This structure also works in the private sector. So for example, in Silicon Valley, it's been very popular to offer employees shares in the organization, and that supposedly will give them a stake not just in earning their salaries and bonuses, but also in the welfare of the company as a whole, so that their private interests are aligned with the overall interest of the firm, and that's something that is much harder to do in a public bureaucracy. So performance management comes out of the business world. The basic idea is you monitor performance, you reward good behavior, and you punish bad behavior. There are a lot of metrics that are used in performance management, but one of the big problems with this approach is that oftentimes it's very hard to measure how well public servants are doing. So in this chart, it comes out of one of my earlier books on state building. You have a matrix. On the x-axis, you have the number of transactions that the public sector is expected to perform that can go from low to high. And you have specificity on the y-axis. Specificity simply means, are you able to measure the performance of the particular public agency that you want, whose performance you want to measure and either reward or punish? If you put some actual types of public agencies into this matrix, there's some that are actually relatively easy to monitor. So central banking, for example, is a clear example of that. Most central banks exist in one building in the capital city. They are usually run by a very small number of highly trained economists, and it is easy to see whether they're doing a good job or not. You can simply go to the store and see what the inflation rate is. And if they're doing a good job, the money supply will be stable and a good basis for transactions. And if they are not good, like Venezuela today, you'll know that pretty quickly. On the other hand, if you think about something like preventive medicine or guidance counseling or teaching in an elementary school, that's actually quite hard to monitor because the transaction volume is extremely high. In India, there are millions of school teachers. And I know that, there was a famous study in the 90s about how many school teachers in India failed to even show up for their classrooms. And so the idea was then to try to put video cameras in to monitor whether they're there or not, but then there are ways of defeating that as a monitoring system and so forth. But you can see that compared to a central bank, which has, a few dozen employees, critical employees, if you're trying to monitor the performance of an education system with millions of employees, it's simply going to be very, very difficult to do. And even if you have a camera in the classroom, how can you judge whether that teacher is being effective or not? It's a very intangible kind of skill that good teachers have, and evaluating that is not terribly easy to do. And that's why I think that the easiest types of public sector reforms to carry out are those that are in the upper left quadrant. If I just go back to the previous slide, the activities that take place in that first quadrant, low transaction volume and high specificity, are the easiest to monitor, and therefore you can use performance measurement to hold people accountable. And I think that's why central banks around the world have gotten much, much better over the last several decades. The Reserve Bank of India is a very professional organization. It's generally run by highly trained economists that are good technocrats, and they understand how monetary policy works. On the other hand, a legal system, an education system, preventative medicine, running clinics in rural areas, those are extremely difficult to monitor and very difficult to hold people accountable in that kind of a system. All right, privatization and outsourcing is something probably not practiced as much in India, but it became a big fad in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and other European countries. The theory was that the government wasn't the best provider of services, and if you have a central bank, they're good economists, but they're not necessarily good at running a cafeteria, and so you ought to outsource these different functions to companies that specialize in providing those kinds of services, and they will be therefore more efficient. It turns out that this is easier said than done, because when you outsource a function to a private or a nonprofit organization outside the government, you have a problem of conflicting principles. The private company wants to make money in addition to serving the contractual obligations that it has to the government, and those can come into conflict. One of the big problems we have in the United States is that by outsourcing implementation, you separate policy making from implementation. This is a subject I want to get back to maybe in the Q&A, because I think it's extremely important for policymakers to think about how their policies are going to be implemented as they are designing them. And then there are a lot of people that simply believe that certain functions are inherently public and shouldn't be given to any private organization. New public management was simply a technique for treating public officials like private sector managers. So, for example, in New Zealand, where this was practiced, the central bank governor is given a contract for 5 years and he's given clear performance metrics. And if he doesn't make those metrics, he's going to be out as the central bank governor and replaced by somebody else. And again, this may work in some countries, but it doesn't take advantage of what's called public service motivation. It treats everybody as a homo economicus, that is a rational, maximizing individual, and doesn't take advantage of the kinds of public service motivations that I think make good bureaucracies work. Adding competition, again, this is something that's been tried in Chile and in the United States, in Britain, and other places. Basically, in education, the idea is that if you give parents vouchers, and they can either use that voucher to put their child in a public school or take that child out and send them to a private school, there would be competition among schools, and there would be a market-like process that would lead to better educational outcomes. I think the empirical evidence with vouchers has been very, very mixed. There have been some successful cases, but unfortunately, vouchers don't work for all students. There are some students whose parents simply aren't all that interested in maximizing their children's educational outcomes, and the system is really disliked by teachers' unions and other stakeholders who have done everything they can to oppose a voucher system. And then finally, shortening the route of accountability. This means decentralizing authority to lower levels of government. States, although in India, a lot of your states are much larger than any European country. And so, the degree of decentralization has to go a lot further, possibly all the way down to a village level. And the reason for doing this is that local officials know local conditions. They have better information, and it's easier to hold them accountable if you can actually go to the city hall and complain to the mayor or the city council. They're more likely to listen to you than if you have to travel all the way to the capital city to complain to, a national official. And again, the theory behind this is good, but oftentimes you run into severe problems of lack of capacity at lower levels. Most countries train their senior bureaucrats, like the IAS in India, but when you get down to a much lower, panchayat or village level, you don't have particularly well-trained officials that you can rely on. Now, that's the economy. The last several slides have all been approaches that economists would use that have to do with incentives. I think a social psychologist would turn rather to norms rather than to incentives. It has to do with the culture of an organization. Social capital is a concept that's been talked about. It's a concept that's been used by social scientists to talk about the social nature of human interaction. People want to be in groups. They want to follow norms. They want to not stick out and go against what the community is pushing for. And therefore, if you use things like self-respect, pride, peer pressure, professional standards, those are the kinds of motivating forces rather than material incentives that are likely to make people work better. And how do you do this? This is really where education and training comes in. Professional training oftentimes implies an inculcation of norms. If you're well trained as a doctor, you follow the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. you're thinking about the interest of your patient rather than simply your own pocketbook. Now, unfortunately, many doctors don't behave that way, but that's the ideal in professional training, is to think of what you do as providing a service rather than simply a job where you're earning money. And it's also an area where leadership is extremely important, because it is leaders that establish goals, expectation, and norms within an organization. And, basically, any organization has got a hierarchical structure of principals and agents and sub-agents and so forth. And the organization works according to that hierarchical structure, but the larger circle around that structure has to do with the culture of the organization and the kinds of expectations that are met. And I think one of the functions of a good leader is to set behavioral standards for the entire organization. If you arrive at the office at 9 or 10 o'clock and you leave at 5, none of your subordinates are going to work, really long hours. And so, in a way, the example really needs to be set at the top of the hierarchy, and it filters down to the rest of the organization, not through orders and commands, but rather by the example that's being set by the senior leaders in the organization. Now, I just want to note that if you ask the historical question of where powerful bureaucracies, modern bureaucracies, have come from, first of all, a lot of them were built in authoritarian periods. This was true of France, Britain, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and a lot of times they came as a result of external pressures, because there's nothing like a national security threat to make people get serious about cracking down on corruption. If your generals are stealing the salaries of their soldiers, the soldiers aren't going to be motivated to fight. There's a sociologist named Charles Tilly that had a very famous theory about the way that war made the state and the state makes war, that it's really war that motivates states to modernize. And this was certainly true of many of the European states that had modern bureaucracies, where the defeat of Prussia by Napoleon led to an important set of reforms in that country in the early 19th century. Britain's problems in the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century led to the Trevelyan Northcote reforms that modernized the British bureaucracy. And many of these reforms were really carried out in conjunction with reform of their elite educational institutions. And so in all of these countries, you had the parallel growth of higher education that was dedicated to training public servants. We taught one of our Leadership Academy courses in Missouri, and so I know perfectly well that the IAS has that kind of tradition, but I suspect it's not as true outside of the IAS, where you don't have dedicated training institutions for many other parts and levels of the bureaucracy. So let me just move on. I'm running out of time a little bit, but I want to get to this really important question of delegation. Over the years, I've come to realize that this is the single most important question that is faced in organizational theory. All organizations have to delegate authority. You can't manage any organization of any scale without delegated authority. There's a couple of reasons for this. People at lower levels of the organization have more local knowledge and can take advantage of that knowledge, and they can act much more quickly. And therefore, good organizations tend to delegate authority to the extent possible. But once you delegate, you lose control. And hierarchies don't like to lose control. They don't like to take risks of that sort. And it means that delegation becomes a very politically controversial issue. Today in the United States, we're having a big fight. Republicans want to reduce the amount of delegated authority to bureaucracies, and I think Democrats and people more on the left want the bureaucracies to have greater authority. And so it's an ongoing fight. And delegation can be particularly problematic in the public sector because if you have a problem with service delivery or corruption, it's going to be politically much more dangerous for the political actors in the system. So these two gentlemen were two great economists from the mid 20th century, Joseph Schumpeter and Friedrich Hayek. They had a big debate in the 1940s over whether socialism or capitalism was a better economic system. So this is decades before the collapse of the Soviet Union, where we tend to think that market-based systems work better than socialist ones. But back in those days, it wasn't clear which of these systems would work. Schumpeter said that a centralized system would be more efficient because it avoided duplication, unnecessary competition, and the like. And Hayek said the opposite, that a decentralized system would inevitably work better, especially as the technological complexity of an economy grew. I'll give you an example of this. All right, so this is a picture of a Boeing 787 jetliner. The background to this is in the Soviet Union, they used to have one agency in Moscow that determined the prices of all products made in that country. They could do this in the 1930s and 40s because it wasn't a very advanced economy. One of these airliners has about 1 million different parts, all of which have different prices. Can you imagine a bureaucracy trying to set prices for every part in a jetliner? Even a turbofan, one turbofan engine has millions of or hundreds of thousands of different parts, and there's no centralized bureaucratic system that can keep track of this. And Hayek said for that reason, you really had to decentralize and delegate authority to lower levels of the organization. Delegation is necessary for those reasons, but the big question is, can you trust the agents? There's a famous expert, Robert Klitgard, who said that corruption is equal to monopoly plus discretion minus accountability. That is to say, the more your activity was monopolistic and the more discretion the leaders had, the more corruption you would have. And you could reduce corruption by increasing accountability or reducing discretion. And so the question is, how do you actually build trust in government? Now, this is my view of how this question is answered, because in many respects, this formula of Klitgard's that you want to reduce the discretion of bureaucrats is the wrong answer in many cases. You do not want to write ex ante rules to govern every aspect of what a bureaucrat does because you don't trust them. You need bureaucrats to be able to exercise their independent judgment and fit that judgment to the particular context in which they're making a decision. But you don't want that autonomy, that discretion to be unlimited because, they're not the boss. It's really the political principle that sets the agenda for the bureaucrat. And so I posited that there's a inverted U where too little autonomy is bad. Bureaucrats have to follow too many rules, but unlimited autonomy is also bad. And there's an optimal point at the apex of that inverted U that would be the right degree of autonomy. And the question is, where do you set that apex point for different bureaucracies? And my theory was that it depends on the capacity. If you have a very low capacity bureaucracy, you want to constrain their decision making to the extent possible. On the other hand, if you've got a very high capacity bureaucracy, you want to give them much more authority to make decisions. I'll just illustrate that from a case in the United States. We have a transportation security agency that monitors passengers going into airplanes. They don't have high school educations, and therefore they have to work according to very detailed rules. They're simply rule followers. On the other hand, the Federal Reserve is staffed by PhD economists. They've got unbelievable discretion to set interest rates, to uh, bail out certain banks and not others. And they're trusted to do this because they are extremely well trained, very well educated bureaucrats. And my general theory is that the degree of delegation is going to depend on the degree of capacity. So that's something we can talk about in the Q&A. So I don't think that there's any optimal degree of bureaucratic autonomy. It depends on quite a number of factors. It varies from one country to another. And basically, you have normative issues that determine the level of autonomy. You don't want to give bureaucrats, you don't want to make them unaccountable. They need to be responsible for the decisions they make. But on the other hand, there are times when it's the political principles that are the ones that are either corrupt or incompetent. And in that case, sometimes the bureaucrats are a check on the principle. You know, they've reversed the authority structure. And in fact, in many bureaucracies, the bureaucrats know more than the political principles, and therefore authority actually naturally travels from the bottom of the organization up to the top. So I'm not going to get into a discussion of the COVID epidemic, but we saw many instances of conflicts between political principles and bureaucrats implementing health policy, and it wasn't always clear, you know, where the proper degree of authority should rest. All right, so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and we will open the floor for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Fukuyama, for this wonderful discourse on covering most of the topics that the Capacity Building Commission is mandated for, and it's extremely relevant for today's approach to governance itself. So I'm going to actually start off with reiterating that the principal mandate of the Capacity Building Commission as the custodian of Mission Karmayogi is, and you covered all those points, how do you enhance performance of a civil servants, and how do you look at it? So the challenges of performance management, and then we also look at accountability frameworks. How do they be held accountable to themselves, to the state, to the citizens whom they're principally mandated to serve? We also look at technology and how do we enable technology-enabled governance. And you might be aware the Prime Minister gave a call for something much more, what I believe is much more than citizen-centric governance. He said Jan Bhagidari, which in English would translate as how does the state work in partnership with citizens? So it's no longer delivering to citizens, but working together for progress. And that's something which is possibly the next level of thinking, and how do we operationalize it? It's easy to state as a statement, but in reality, working with some of the structures which are reasonably fossilized and set in a particular context to advance it to the level of partnership is something else that we're all struggling with. So I'm going to also clarify that it's not just the Labasna, I know you're very familiar with it, which trains the IAS, but we have more than 800 academies across India with every line ministry for different cadres. So a lot of effort is now going into making sure that there's a democratization of capacity building at the civil servants level. And so that's also part of the mandate of the commission. So I'm going to begin with something which sounded very fascinating to me is you spoke about a strong state. And then I also wanted to understand, in the context of India, we're also a large state and we're complex. We are a federal structure, and the states decide how to do or how to operate, and many of them may not be in alignment with the national government, and therefore may see every program initiated by the national government as something that they should possibly keep it out of the door. In this context, how do you think India should focus on building state capacity? The reality of panchayats, urban local bodies as units of governance, which are mandated by a constitutional amendment more than 50 years ago, to the national government setting the trend and the momentum for change. How do you balance these forces? And I would love to hear your thoughts, and how have other countries actually applied some of the governance principles, especially to improve governance at the grassroots level, where it really matters. Because for me, I kept getting challenged in my job. Citizen centricity is very, very at a different level. And the citizen footprint of the national government is not as much. And how do we really manage these tensions, and what would your advice be?
Well, I think that most political scientists that look at the design of political institutions would argue that uh, countries need to decentralize authority, but particularly ones that are large and diverse really need a form of federalism. They need to delegate authority, not, as I said, just to a state level, but to levels below that. Now, India is a perfect example of this. India is a big country. It is incredibly diverse in terms of language, caste, religion, so forth. And so I don't see any other way of governing a country like India without delegating substantial authority to localities. And in fact, even as I understand it, even in the judiciary, you have different forms of law being applied in different parts of the country. And that may upset people that have this very abstract view of what the state is and what it should be. But the reality is that you can't govern a diverse society in a single manner. I think that what's important for the national government to be aware of is this principle of subsidiarity. This is used in Catholic social thought and in Europe. And basically, what subsidiarity says is that every level of government ought to have authority that's appropriate to that level. So the national government obviously takes care of national defense, security issues, foreign policy. There are certain policies, social policies that will be rolled out at a national level. Um, uh, but many other functions do not need to be uniform, and they can have lots of variance from one region to another. Now, what this leads to then is things like localized corruption, because in many countries, the local government is not modern. You don't have a lot of well-trained, educated people, and it's captured by different social groups. I don't think there's anything you can do about this in the end, because if a central government in such a large country tries to make everything uniform, you're just going to fail at that. You don't have the state power to produce that kind of uniformity. Even in China, that has a much longer tradition of state centralization, they still permit a huge amount of variation, from one prefecture to another, because conditions are simply uh, different. So I think one thing you need to do is lower your expectations for uniformity and centralized control, and accept the fact that you are going to have to decentralize. Now, the second issue that you raised on how do you get more public input and how do you get the government to work with the public and not just over the public, I actually have a whole separate lecture on. We could have spent another hour talking about that. I think that in most democracies, uh, people have realized that the formal institutions of democracy do not provide enough public input, right? So you have an election every few years, you get a prime minister, a cabinet, a legislature, but the distance between those bodies and the actual governance is very, very large. And if somebody is unhappy with, let's say, the way that the school system is working locally, and you have to go all the way to the national ministry, that doesn't work. And so you need other forms of public participation. I think in Europe and in the United States, we've developed, a lot of different approaches to public participation, especially here in California, my home state, where we had a populist movement in the early 20th century that created a lot of populist kinds of mechanisms for participation. So we can have citizen initiatives or referenda. We can recall officials out of sequence in the middle of their terms, things of that sort. There was a very important law passed in 1946, the Administrative Procedure Act, that I think was the first law that really mandated public participation. So if a bureaucracy wants to change a rule, they have to publish it in the federal record and allow a 90-day notice and comment period where ordinary citizens or interest groups, labor unions, companies can comment on the rule change, and the agency has to then take into account citizen feedback. In infrastructure cases, which we've been, working with Sitaram, teaching, I think that public input into a big infrastructure project is absolutely critical. If you don't get comments on whether you actually want to locate this big hydroelectric dam in this particular part of the river valley, or if you're planning a big train station in the middle of a busy city, and you don't talk to the people that are actually affected by it, you're setting yourself up for a big failure. But the trick is to get enough public comment, but not that necessarily override, a general sense of public interest. And there does need to be a little bit of hierarchical decision making that takes account of public, comment, but isn't necessarily beholden to it. And you can go to the other extreme where there's too much public participation, and it makes it really impossible to actually have the government make any real decisions, because too many political actors have a veto over what's going to happen. We actually wrote a case about the Tata Nano, the decision to locate the car factory, and the public protest that then kind of scuppered the deal, and so forth. And so there are cases where the wrong kind of participation makes public decision making, pretty much impossible. But like I said, this is a subject that can be elaborated endlessly, and getting the right mechanisms in place, I think, is a really tricky question now.
For a person of your stature and wisdom, I know a lot of questions are there, but we may not have the time to cover it. But I'm going to have one last question asked of you. Today is a world of big tech, and we seem to be advancing at a rate which is sometimes incomprehensible for people like me. And you've written a lot about it. So I would like, India is now at that point where we do use tech extensively, both in governance and outside. At the same time, we are now looking at making policies and how to look at this enormously challenging space. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that, and how do you see that? How does it now go with democracy and all the challenges that we face?
Well, look, big tech is a problem for democracy, because anytime you have that kind of concentrated wealth, you're going to have concentrated power, and it's not going to be democratically distributed. Like today, we've got this big problem with Elon Musk. He's the richest man in the world. He's like a loose cannon that, decides to help this candidate and not the other candidate. And it's like he's become an, independent political actor all by himself. And it's really a problem when you have this kind of oligarchy that has so much concentrated power that then becomes political. And that's a good reason for having antitrust or competition policies that, make sure that you don't have this kind of concentrated power. And right now, the particular problem is that because these are internet companies, they're internet platforms, they control communications. And communications inherently is political, right? Politics depends on communication. And so if you can control the communications channels, you can control politics. And I think so I don't have an answer to this problem. I mean, but I do think that it is a really big challenge to democracy, because technology has allowed for a concentration of power. It's ironic, because when the personal computer was first introduced, we thought it would be very democratizing. Everybody would have their own computer, and you could get information very cheaply, and all of that has happened. But we didn't anticipate that the people providing this technology would then end up so rich. And that's just the way things worked out. But we do need to have political counterweights to that power. And, there are various ways of doing it, but I don't think we found a good formula for that.
Thank you so much, Professor Fukuyama. I know we have got a lot of questions, but I must apologize to all the audience that we don't have the time to respond to that. if you permit and if it's okay, I could send you these questions, and if whenever you or your team finds the time to respond, we could possibly also share that with the audience a little later. And again, it's such a privilege and a pleasure to have you on our show, on this podcast. We have these weekly webinars where we expose our civil servants to different things that's happening around the world, apart from the formal capacity building that happens, because expanding knowledge and engaging in lifelong learning is a mandate and something, a vision of the Prime Minister, so that we keep building our capacities to become future ready. So with that word, and thanking all our audience for joining us and looking forward to every Wednesday morning, I thank Professor Fukuyama. Thank Dr. Sitaram for suggesting that we have you, and we make sure that we could get you in January itself. And I'm glad that you could make the time for us. So thank you once again. And I thank everybody who was responsible for making sure this webinar went well. Thank you.
Okay.
And
Have a good day.
thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.